Hello to everyone, and this podcast episode is joined by Matthew McKee and Chris Lofrese, two co-founders of the wonderful, amazing Upend Gin that we have had the pleasure of drinking and appreciating and loving. So welcome to you both. I'm super grateful for you taking some time out to speak to us. Hello, hello.
Hi, thank you for having us. Yeah, and thank you for that lovely intro.
For people who, this is a really easy question to start with, both, but for people who don't know where you're from, who you are, other than my introduction just then, can you give us a flavor of who you guys are?
Sure. I'll start. Matt and I are, two friends. Grew up in New York, both of us. I grew up in upstate New York. Depends where you consider upstate New York, because the further up you get, the more upstate is to those people. But I grew up in Orange County, Middletown, New York. Matt and I worked together. Matt's from Long Island. We worked together for several years, and we are New York. We're trying to represent New York. I went to college in New York, went to Iona as a undergrad and graduate, and then Matt and I found each other a few years later working in finance, and we enjoyed drinking together, and that's kind of the genesis of Upend, and we'll get more into it, but I'll leave it there for my intro. And Matt can talk a little bit about his background.
Like Chris said, I grew up on Long Island, also went to college in New York, way upstate, more upstate than where Chris is from. And we met. We were both working in finance, sitting across from each other, and frequently talking about different craft spirits. We were drinking and trying. One day, one of us said, "Oh, we should start our own." And it's one of those ideas that was thrown out there, never thinking that it would actually take root, but it did.
That's you, though. That's you.
I know, exactly.
Next thing you know, we're talking to you, designing labels and tops.
So were you actually drinking whilst coming up with the idea of this new distillery, or was this still in the sober stages of the night?
This is what I call, my family's always called it back porch talk. It's after a couple of drinks on the back porch, you come up with great ideas. But Matt is what I would call the dreamer of the two of us. And when he, thinks about an idea, he goes grand and all in and dives in head first. I'm a little bit more pragmatic about it. He took the lead initially and kind of figured out how we could get into this business, because neither one of us really have a background in distilling. I would say the closest we have is my grandfather was in the distribution business, and that is kind of the genesis of my interest in the business, right? Growing up around him, he always had the liquor paraphernalia, mirrors on the wall, different liquor brand hats and polos and things like that. And it was always around. And one of the like rites of passages as a family, as you come of age, was the Beefeater martini. It was kind of like the cornerstone of our cocktail hour, and very dry Beefeater martini, at the point where vermouth really didn't even enter the house. That's how it became, and so that was my interest. He was a distributor. Beefeater was one of the brands he distributed, and he was talking about bringing it into the Hudson Valley and going to the liquor stores and looking at the prices of the other gins and always pricing Beefeater, $1 more so that it would be more premium than the other brands and look better. So anyway, going back to the background, we don't have a farm, we don't have distilling backgrounds, but Matt went out there and figured out that we could do this even without that, and he went full in. Took a little convincing to get me on board, but we both were very interested in the business, and so it kind of took off from there.
That's amazing. And in fact, that was one of my questions that I really wanted to delve into. Is I'm always interested in that dynamic of leadership and entrepreneurialism. And, you've both had each other to lean on effectively. And you're kind of both bringing Matt being the dreamer, you being the pragmatic person, in your words. I'm not judging, but, but bringing both sides together. Actually, that's a really good harmony to have when you're pushing forward what can feel quite a risky move, guys. Do you think that risk, throwing yourself into, I would say, calculated risk is something that, feeds in from that financial background?
I think part of it does, right? We have an understanding of what calculated risk is, but I think the bigger aspect is that we didn't know what we were getting ourselves fully into. We didn't understand how big the risk was, right? So if we look back at it today, knowing what we know now, it may have been a different conversation.
But
I
okay,
think,
that's actually an interesting, Matt, before you carry on, that's a really interesting point. Is if you looked back to when you started, maybe it was, you would have thought things different. If you were to go back to that Matt 2018, Chris 2018, if not before, what would you just warn them about?
Well, I don't know if there was necessarily a warning. I'll give that some thought. I related to triathlons I've done in the past, right? And once I'm doing it, if I had thought it through before, if I knew how painful the experience would be, I probably wouldn't have done it, right? But if you don't train, you just show up, you do the race.
Yeah. This certainly would have been something I would have never done if it wasn't for Matt, right? It was outside of my comfort zone. And that's not like the way that I go about things. And Matt really, brought me along in the early stages, and being able to lean on him on the early parts and his let's go do this and head on and throw caution to the wind is why we got into it. Maybe that would be our warning to ourselves if we could go back, would be, think it through a little bit more. Don't get ahead of yourself, because we probably jumped into things, a little faster than we probably should have. And but I don't, like Matt says, if you don't do that, you probably don't get past that first stage, right? You have to kind of just dive in.
100%. I guess it's one of those, you almost, you can convince yourself out of anything, really. There's always a reason not to do something and to just lean in. Perhaps the not knowing what's to come and not knowing this industry is probably the best asset that you had, because you can just fly into it and see what happens.
Yeah, it's the best and worst. It hurt our forecasting early on. It was not really on par with what you would expect.
It was a little optimistic.
But that's part of the game. You learn it, and we're still green, and we're still learning so much, and we're not even close to having a full grasp of what this whole business is. And every day we're picking up different parts of it. It's been a fun ride and learning curve, picking up all these things. And I love talking business, and I like that we have this platform here to do this with you today. Kind of reminisce through how we went through everything, and maybe we'll learn something from what we went through today, pick up a little tidbit here or there from things we might not have gone back and looked at.
100%. And I'm sure our listeners will too. I think it's pretty, I think already, just from these first 10 minutes where you've said that potentially you might have been optimistic at the very beginning about those numbers, I'm pretty sure that 98% of our listeners will be like, oh, thank goodness. Yeah, we did too.
Yeah, I think that's the biggest surprise to us, probably the difficulty, right, in distribution, and the time it takes to ramp up. But
it's not good product. It's not just good product and good branding. There's so much more behind it. We thought we'd come out with a high quality gin and terrific packaging and branding and all that, and be very genuine on to what we are, right? Because we're not a distillery, right? We don't own a distillery. So getting into this business that way allowed us to get in, But it's also shaped what we're going to do next too, a little bit. And we can get into that later on, I think. But yeah, I think there's so much that you get into the business and you're like, okay, we have this great gin. Everyone that we're sampling this with loves it. We designed it to how we wanted to drink gin, right? And the whole concept behind Upend and trying to get these very different flavor profiles. We did that with our first two, and they're complete polar opposite types of gin. And we were like, okay, this is going to be good. We're going to have like all these different type of people like our gin. Packaging, award winning on both ends. The stuff that's in the bottle and the bottle itself. And we're like, all right, the distributors are going to love it. Everyone's going to love it. We're going to get picked up. It's going to be great. And then you're like, wait, there's a grind. And we forgot about the grind that we have to go through. And that's what we're going through.
Yeah. Yeah. And I think that that's incredibly humbling, I think, for a lot of people out there who are entering and in this space, that it's that the achievements and successes that are being experienced across the industry are a result not just of just design decisions and just a good idea. It's grit, resilience, and some pretty savvy decision making along the way. Let's go back a little bit, because Upend at first probably doesn't mean a lot to a lot of people, but actually when you delve into that story, it means a lot to a lot of people. Can you tell us a little bit? It's very you. It's the two of you coming together, isn't it? Tell us a little bit more.
Yeah, great. I'm glad we get the opportunity to get into it a little bit. Yeah, Upend on its face can, like you said, it may not have an attachment to it, but on the simplest form, right? Matt and I wanted to combine our backgrounds, where we're from, and our representation of our New York lifestyle. And so it's upstate New York, East End of Long Island. So that's on its face value. That's where we came up with the name. But also it's the idea of, upending people's perception of gin in particular, right? We've always walked through, and even Matt is a little guilty of this. In the early stages, Matt was not a huge gin fan, right? We would, yeah. Little secret, no, but he was a brown liquor fan. He loved his whiskeys, and so do I. And that's how we would initially, spend our time at the bars sampling different craft whiskeys and new brands and things like that. But I started to introduce him to gin, and he was like, "Yeah, gin's good. I love it in Negroni." Him and his grandfather, right, Matt?
My dad.
It was your dad. Him and his dad loved sampling Negronis. That was their drink to share together. But he was like, outside of that, gin. This is gin. And so that's when I was like, wait, you haven't tried like what gin is. I was like, there's a whole universe of what gin could be.
Yeah. I tried about 200 different gins.
Yes.
Oh, is this how we're justifying it? Okay. Yeah,
I see. Matt now has tried way more brands of gin than I have. There's a picture of us early on with at his apartment with this table full of different gins, and we're just going through and sampling and like trying to pick up what we like here, what we like there, and kind of like just going through. We had these notebooks that we were taking down all of our notes on to get our tastings, our sample tastings, and
rigorous research.
Yeah, 100%.
Right,
very important stage.
Yeah, and so Upend is upending perception of gin. That singular flavor profile. It's not that. There's so much more to it. And then, as we were going through things, we started to like really, buy into that brand message, and almost naturally came this saying, it was upend your perception of gin. It's not where you start, it's where you end up. And to us, that's taken on like so much more meaning, right? There's so much that you could look at where you start and at our business and where we were right when we started our business, where we were in our previous careers and all that stuff. And we could have just rode along and not tested any of those waters. But we decided to dive into this project, and we're hoping, we're starting small. We hope we end up being something that, at least for New York and specifically, the regions that we're from, that we represent them, and can get back to them at the end of the day, and help those local economies and things like that. And hope, we can bring everyone along on the ride with us as much.
I love that.
Yeah.
I love that. I think there's an aspiration that everyone can call on with the, it's not how you start, it's how you end up. I really appreciate that, but I also love how that just relates straight back to your stories, your different backgrounds, and where you've come from, and that representation is really important. And it's also what makes you unique, which I think will be something we delve into a little bit. We talked about New York. I'm going to confess that I have not been there yet, which is diabolical. But I was really interested what the gin culture was like in New York.
It's good. Matt, you visited a few places. We visited a few places, right? I mean, there's in the city you get a lot of gin bars, right? What we've noticed is that that is spreading a little bit. The U.S. is obviously a good gin market. New York is a good spirits market. We're not on, the level of London or the UK really a lot of Europe in general, in terms of where gin is, right? Gin's a very, very small part of the market here. But as we're going out there, that mixology culture that's really taken off post-COVID is taking roots in some of the really high-quality bars in the rest of New York. And if you're into mixology, you know that you have to have gin as part of what you're doing. Elevates a lot of cocktails that you can't do with just vodka, and that you wouldn't want to particularly use other spirits for. So that's starting to take hold. We have a long way to go. We hope we're in the early stages of that. But that, I think that you've seen a little pickup because of that culture that came out of COVID.
Yeah, 100%. I think for most businesses, particularly businesses in this industry who started in 2018 and 19, I'm really feeling for them because they're getting going, and then it's like, COVID.
Yeah.
But when I talk to a lot of our clients or a lot of people, distillers, COVID's kind of met them in two different ways. I think it's, of course, we're never going to sidestep the fact that it was a really significant era in our lifetimes, and it has had a detrimental impact on a lot of people across the globe. But as you say, it has spurred this trend of, do you know what? I'm appreciating drinking better, drinking higher quality, drinking more curiously, as you mentioned in mixology. How does that now sort of form a part in your rollout? Are you looking to maybe educate more bartenders about how they can use your gin?
Yeah, I'll jump in quick, but I'll let Matt take the tail end of that. Matt is a little bit better mixologist than I am. As I mentioned, our beefeater martinis were just straight gin. And most of the time I drink anything from cocktail standpoint, the mixing was the ice. But I've learned a lot from Matt, and my repertoire has grown since then, and experimenting and introducing it to my family. But one of the phrases that we've used lately, and we've kind of emphasized it as we've gone out there and we've talked to people, is this idea of drinking with care, right? But choosing quality over quantity, and make the cocktail. And that's why we wanted to bring a premium gin to the market. We want people to enjoy a high quality cocktail, right? Sit there, sip it, enjoy it with friends. It's about choosing to pick something that you can enjoy. And I think that's what the younger generation is kind of bringing to the table, right? There's this damp lifestyle that's out there. And I think that's the way to go, right? I'm behind the idea of this moderation. Do it in the right way and choose high quality ingredients. And then I'll let Matt talk about the the bartender scene and maybe how that influenced us. You could get into why we did Navy Strength too.
Yes, so a lot of the work is educating bartenders in terms of how our gins fit into their repertoire. Like Chris said, the first iteration we came out with is a Navy Strength. We wanted a high quality, high proof, high flavor, a really bold representation of gin. It's funny, Chris being the one to introduce me to gin, and then I come around really wanting to design like the epitome of what gin is, right? Very juniper forward. But it's balanced out with some really nice warming spices and some other botanicals that you pick up on the finish that we can get into a little bit. But it is, in part, working with the bartender to see what they're trying to do, right? What do they want their cocktail list to look like? What are they trying to highlight? And the Navy Strength gin works really well in, say, Negroni. I'm a little biased towards that cocktail.
Clearly.
as Chris has mentioned. But the sweet tea gin, for instance, works much better in other cocktails. The juniper is toned down quite a bit. It's a more delicate gin. It has matcha and green tea and chamomile tea, and a lot of citrus, right? But it doesn't have that bold flavor profile that Navy Strength does. So the cocktails that it typically works well at are more delicate, right? They don't have those very strong liqueurs like Campari. They're typically more fruit forward.
Yeah, I always say that the Navy Strength is our sipping cocktail gin, and the sweet tea is like that refreshing cocktail gin, the one they're probably served in a highball, something that's easy to drink, laid back, those type of cocktails, and then the ones where you need a stronger gin and want to sip on.
And,
I
kind of
no, Matthew, go.
One of our other ideas that we, when we were thinking about what we were going to do before we came up with Upend and focusing on gin, it's blurring the lines between different categories, right? And I think it's really interesting. Chris was talking about how small the gin market is in the U.S., and I think so much of it is marketing, right, at the spirit level, because you have these botanical vodkas, and the difference between a botanical vodka and gin is one ingredient, right? And it can be turned up like the Navy Strength, very juniper forward, and it can be turned down like the sweet tea gin. And what makes it a gin versus a botanical vodka is really just marketing at the end of the day, right?
Totally. And I guess that it goes back to what you were saying about, working with bartenders so they understand how that mixology creates new flavors. But it's also that marketing. When we think about marketing, we always think, social media, going to trade shows, getting some billboards out. But it's actually also about building brand through experience. And if those consumers are engaging with your gin in a bar, that it's almost that bartender is starting to become your advocate as well.
Yeah, for sure.
And we were talking to a distillery last week who was just talking about this very fact and how some bars are now starting to use the bottle as a means of, because consumers are wanting to know more. They want to be educated. They want to understand what it is that they're appreciating. Chris, you mentioned experimentation, albeit I think you meant in terms of those back porch conversations, but that experimentation seems really important to the Upend brand. It's something you talk about a lot on your website. How has that influenced your choices and releases? And, is it influencing your next release potentially?
Yeah, right. So you're referring to one of our additional tagline is like experimentation is everything. So sip it, mix it, but most of all, enjoy it. Right. And I think that when we approached the gin space, we wanted to pay homage to what gin was, right? And we didn't want to forget the history and everything that's come before us. And that's why Navy Strength, was our first iteration, because for us, that's like quintessential, gin flavor profile, very juniper forward, going back to the British Royal Navy and all that stuff. And we could get into the Navy strength story, but I feel like a lot of people know it. And then we wanted to do what we've always talked about, which is get this modern twist on it. And it's not like we're going to reshape what gin is, but we want to reshape what the consumer thinks about when they're thinking about gin. And we want them to realize that, hey, look, you could go to our Navy strength, you might love it, you might hate it, but that doesn't mean that you love or hate gin. You could go out there and try our sweet tea, and you could love our sweet tea, or you could hate it, right? Like, there's just, each gin is unique. To me, like, the story is like, someone who says they don't like gin, to me is like saying you don't like beer, right? It's like, you probably do. You just haven't tried the one that you like, right? Because you might not like IPAs. Sure, you don't like the Navy strength. But you might like, one of the fruit beers, like our sweet tea, gin, something that's completely different. You wouldn't recognize them as really the same thing, other than that they're under a category, right? And that's the world that we walked into, right? There's these categories of spirits, and they're defined and they're out there. But I think to a lot of consumers, they almost don't matter. They don't care. Is it a botanical vodka? Is it a flavored gin? Is it a liqueur? Wherever it falls, I think the consumer at the end of the day, and this is, I think, has come really out of the COVID experience, and going back to what you're saying, where people are more educated, we're finding that all the time, and they're less concerned about what they're being told that the spirit is, and more concerned about how it's made. Is it high quality? Does it taste good? Can it be additive to what I'm doing with my cocktails? And we're finding that from the consumer and the bartenders. I think there's a lot of bartenders out there who have been held back a little bit by the places that they're at and the consumers that they've been dealing with, and afraid to kind of adventure into some more obscure cocktails, or just less utilized in mainstream menus. And I think the past few years has opened the door for a lot of them to go out there and say, hey, I know you always come in here and you just drink this, XYZ martini. Let me try to make you something. I think you'll like this flavor profile. And having a bartender that does that, and that's who we're trying to find. Most of the places that we're at, we've become very friendly with the owners and the bartenders, and they're all about supporting local, and they're all about learning about the spirits that they put behind the bar and taking some ownership in it. And that's been huge to us.
That's really interesting, actually, because when we talk a lot about our customers, or when I ask a lot about customers, there's always a different persona, but it's very rare. Perhaps it's not the first thing that people think of is actually the bartenders. They're almost like the custodians of your drink, and a bit of an influencer, if you will, for how that gets rolled out in the community. Yeah, 100%.
It was actually a bartender in your neck of the woods that was one of the early influencers of Upend.
Oh, right?
Yeah.
Okay.
It was at the American Bar. And I was in town meeting with Nude, our branding firm, and trying different gin cocktails at some of the top bars in London. And was chatting with the bartender about, different nuances of gin and what he liked, what he didn't like, and looking for things that I could try that weren't available in the U.S. And he pulled out a Tarkin Sea Dog. And I was like, that is good.
That's brilliant.
That is very good. So that was a big early inspiration.
Yeah, I mean, he told you there's a hole for Navy strength in his menu. Like, he could use it, yeah.
And partnering with bartenders in the U.S., recipe development. It's been, I'd say, the research and development is the most fun part of this job. It leads to some nights that aren't always damp, but, going back and forth with the bartenders, getting their input, trying out different cocktails. It's been a lot of partnership and iteration. It's a lot of fun. That's the experimentation.
Yeah, and I think that's also as a result of you guys being quite open-minded and being humble in the idea of like we're not the experts here. We're bringing some insight, but let's get that insight from the ground and from the people who are actually doing the drinking and the people who are doing the serving. I think it's a really interesting approach that you have now almost developed your own network of feedback that you're getting in the community and beyond. That's kind of cool. So you put a lot of effort into the flavor palette and creating these two very distinct flavor profiles for your gins. Obviously, the flagship one being Navy Strength Gin and Sweet Tea Gin, which is just really intriguing to me anyway. I've never seen it before ever, and I like gin. So when you've put all that effort into the flavor, how important is it to then represent that flavor with your bottle?
Yeah, I mean, packaging is what gets it off the shelf, right? And for a place that doesn't have its own location to like drive the consumer demand outwards, the packaging is what gets it off the shelf. And it was something that obviously we really wanted to focus on premium and then making high end gin, right? And high quality gin. And we wanted the outside of the bottle to be a representation of what is inside and be part of the whole experience. And you mentioning, that people are starting to look at the bottle that they're drinking out of a lot more and getting the story there. So it's our way of delivering our story, and it's our way of delivering the experience that we hope the consumer will have with the gin, and that's the starting point. Obviously, being New York and the idea of this marriage between the history and this new style of gin or modern takes is evidence in our labels, right? So we have our copper top label. That's a actual metal, label. And then we have our patinaed bottom label. The up label is copper. The bottom label is a patinaed copper. So it's this marriage of new copper and old copper. It's textural. It has like a really cool feel to it. And then we brought that all the way up to the top, which is a full metal top, one that I always warn people, watch your toes when you take it off, because everyone pulls tops off because they're usually they don't have the weight that ours has. So I see people all the time pulling it off and, they're like, whoa, this is heavy, because it's a very weighted top, and it's a copper bolt shaped top, right, to be represented. Okay.
For people who might not know, we've got one right here, which I personally love. I took this a while ago, and it just sits on my desk. It's like a toad, but just the heavy feel. I was going to ask you about this when you talked earlier on, when you started talking about was it your dad or granddad who was the distributor?
Yeah, it was my grandfather. Yeah,
your grandfather, and how he was always saying that, like, actually with Beefeater, it's like there's the market, and then we're the plus one, and that's what premium meant at the time, and you knew that's what the market you were going after. Of course, over time, premium has now been built into multiple different segments in itself.
Sure.
But it's interesting because premiumization is not going anywhere. It's here to stay, but the heavyweight feel of that that stopper, how does that contribute to that feeling of premium? Is it important? Do we need to?
It's all part of the experience, right? You hold that bottle, it has weight to it. You pull that top off, it has weight to it. It's setting the stage for, okay, this is, they put work into it. They paid attention to what they're doing on the outside of this. I'm sure they paid attention to what's on the inside. And we did,
Totally.
We did. Listen, we developed our spirit, right? Like, we knew what we wanted to develop and the taste profile we wanted and the spirit that was in there. And we got there. And the packaging was our way of bringing our brand story to the spirit. And I think, the quality, and I'll let Matt comment on it, just that weight, it matters. I think to the consumer, it matters that you pay attention to every little detail that's on there.
100%. I completely agree. And I stopped you there, Chris, when you were talking about the different elements and you were talking about the labels and the metal labels and the contrast of textural and those sorts of details matter because you're going beyond looks now. You're picking up a bottle to make the pour. So every time someone's doing that.
I think it was the first time Signet ever did a wraparound overlapping metal label. You know, it was all part of the pushing the boundary type of thing. You know, the die cast top, you know, that's an alloy, you know, like all of it was testing the limits of what you could really do, for good or bad. You know, it's obviously, you know,
another learning experience.
That there's nothing built to make these things, right? You know, like no one has the machines to put these labels on or whatever it is. So everything, you know, takes a little bit more effort to do it, but I think that's part of it too. You know, it gets it
totally.
Absolutely. Labeling, you know, thousands of bottles by hand, and then figuring out how to ship them because they're so heavy. They need reinforced cardboard to get it to the store.
You need to think about all these things now, and I think that's what we encourage our clients too, who we're lucky to work with, is that it isn't just about the design, albeit it starts with good design. And that's fundamental. It's about taking the next step of, right, is this fit for a manufacturer? Can this actually be created en masse? And sometimes that's not the prerogative. You're only creating 20. It could be as sophisticated and ornate as possible. I'm guessing that's not where we're going at Upend. So we're going down another route of thinking about, right, well, how is this going to travel? How is this going to get to you? Different climates and environments. What's New York like over the summer? I hear very hot.
Yeah.
So all these things need to be considered. And the shape of the stopper, it's like a bolt, if you will. And you were saying that actually lends itself to, it's quite an industrious look. Was that specifically for a reason?
Yeah, going after the New York industrial, urban, bold kind of mentality.
It's a nod to that, isn't it?
Yeah, that's the nod to New York.
And what I love about it as well is, I mean, I guess it's a play with words, but it's relevant either way up, if that makes sense. Excuse the pun, which I've almost actually said. So that rotating typeface and the details around that. I mean, I feel like the bolt has become almost quite an iconic part of your brand. Would you say?
Yeah, I mean, it's on. I mean, it is like our logo at this point, and it's representation. You know, and again, right, the idea that it rotates and you can have it upend or end up, and you know, the way we did the upend, you know, that took a lot of thought too, and that, you know, the branding firm that Matt mentioned, New Brand, you know, helped us a lot with thinking about how we can make this idea of it's circular, but also like you can view it from either way, you know, and it's reflective in a bar mirror, and the end looks the correct way if you're looking at it in the bar mirror. Just a lot of thought went into all those little pieces because we always wanted to have the idea that, you know, this upend and end up, and you know, a lot of times when we will do newsletters out to people, you'll see us start sentences and end sentences that way and things like that, and we try to play on it because it's important to us for everything to kind of tie back to it, right? And I mean, that's what branding is, and
of course,
yeah, I mean, we hired a very great team there that helped us walk through all those little details, because I'll tell you, me and Matt would not have paid attention to all those little details if we didn't have a good team around us.
100%. And may I take this opportunity to give them a little whoop whoop, a little shout out. New Brand Creative are our friends, and we really appreciate working with talent like them. So let's definitely give them the kudos that they deserve on this bottle for sure. I mean, of course, you had a vision, or you had some ideas, and Nude Creative turned that into something that actually looks like something on a bottle. What came first in your mind as business savvy entrepreneurs opening up your own distillery, opening up your own drinks brand? What came first, the priority? Was it budget, or was it getting design and that right, and then almost reverse engineering? I'm always curious.
That's a good question. All right, budget didn't come first. We're still waiting on that, I think, a little bit. But the the I mean the genesis was always the representation of our backgrounds. Trying to get us both into the brand, and obviously, Upend kind of came through that process. We had gone through several different ways of trying to incorporate both upstate New York and Long Island and things like that, and the representation of full New York, right? The idea that New York isn't just New York City, even though that's, a cultural hub and one that's representative worldwide. There's so much more to the state. So it was that, it was our backgrounds, and it was really, I think initially the spirit drove a lot of it too. We wanted to make sure that we could stand behind what we were pouring to people, regardless of what we were pouring it out of or how much it costs or whatever that was. So, first was being able to stand behind the spirit. And I think then second, after we incorporate all of us, was, well, how do we deliver the spirit the right way to everyone? And we spent a lot of our time focused on those things. There's a lot of brands out there that build themselves through external marketing, spending a lot of dollars on the marketing spend. We spent a lot of our time on the brand and what's in the bottle. That was our main focus at the beginning.
Yeah, I think that really drove the budget, right? We knew we wanted to be ultra premium, high quality liquid, high quality design that represents the liquid. And then, all right, well, what do we need to do in order to produce that?
Yeah, absolutely. And make it cost effective at the same time. But I'm always curious around this because we get the question a lot, of course, we would. And you can always tell where that's coming from. It's, how much is enough. And then there's a segment of distillers who are approaching it with we are obviously not going to blow every single dollar. We're a business, but we appreciate that we have one chance at creating something pretty special. And you can see the difference, and you can obviously see the successes as a result. So thank you for sharing that approach that you've taken. I won't take too much more of your time. I promised you that I'd let you go to your busy lives. What's the end goal for you both for Upend?
Well, I think that we're very excited about what's coming next for us, right? We've done this very hyper-focused launch of our brand. We've learned a lot about where we are, like where we place in the marketplace, what our consumer looks like, where we fit behind the bar, what type of places work for us. And we've become very confident that a lot of what we thought was going to happen in terms of where that would end up, it actually did. And the next stages for us, we really want to bring something back home. We've always had the idea of building out our own distillery and having a home base in New York that's ours. Early on, we were always throwing back and forth the idea of would we be on Long Island or would we be up by me in the Hudson Valley. And we've really found a really good home here in the Hudson Valley. I moved back here almost 2 years ago after, not that I was far away, I was on the other side of the river. But I came back home, and I think we want to bring a distillery to this area. So the next step for us is that. We're very early on in it. Hopefully the anticipation it will have time to build for sure. Hopefully it doesn't have too much time to build from this point forward. But we're gonna bring in our own distillery, which will allow us to really deliver everything the way we want to. Have experiences in the tasting room where people can try different iterations, right? We want to start expanding our brand. Obviously, gin, we always had this idea going through different flavor profiles and hitting the different parts of the wheel. Our flavors are meant to be bold, relatable, identifiable. We don't try to overcomplicate them. The sweet tea gin, we named it that because we thought that sweet tea gin will help bring in people who may not normally try gin, and it has. But it's also very straightforward of what's in there, right? It's tea and it has a sweetness. Our Navy strength is strong, right? We want to hit some other areas of that gin wheel, and then we want to experiment with other things. We do see other spirits coming out of our distillery when we finally get there, and we kind of want to build the home, right? Hudson Valley. We want people to be here and be proud of it and can represent, the area, and then have that be the way that we grow.
Wow. You've got me excited. And I saw, as soon as you said we'll branch out potentially into other spirits, I'm definitely saw an eyebrow raise with Matthew being like, yeah, we are. Yeah, we are. Going back to the roots, where we'll start some more market research, of course. I think that sounds really brilliant. And I think you've done it right. 2018, you're right. You're not a hugely, a long heritage brand. You're still in that beginning stages. You've proven concept.
Yeah, really 2020 is when our spirit hit the market. 2018 was laying the ground.
You guys.
Yeah, 2020, August 2020 is the first time we hit the floor and running. And that, luckily, we were in the tail end of 2020 because the early end would have been devastating.
Not so great. Yeah, 100%. And actually, I think we're seeing a long tail effect of that in the industry. I think 2023 was tough, generally across the board. I think those that are particularly premium have shown that resilience, and I think that's a nod to why that strategy is so important to drinks, not only because we've put so much effort into the flavor, why not? But we really need to convince consumers to really understand why it's worth the investment and that something's coming in.
Listen, there's a lot of good distilleries in this area too, and we hope that we can be part of growing the recognition for the whole area, because there's some good distilleries, good distillers in this area that some of them only really distribute things out of their distillery itself, but they put out good product, and we hope that we can be part of that, get a good distillery tour going through this area, and I think that helps everyone.
100%.
Yeah,
I completely agree. I think it's again going back to that experience, and community is important. I think there's no point us all being in silos and reinventing the wheel. There's a lot to be appreciated, and as you said, gin is a spectrum. It's not something that needs necessarily to be protected. Actually, there's a lot to offer in this space, and luckily, from looking at some of the predictive data of how this market is growing, that's lending itself quite well for gin. Based on some predictive data. So I think it's meant to grow globally at a 37% growth rate. Having 2023 being a bit of a slower year than we'd like, I think this is really promising for your plans going forward. One last question.
Have multiple bottles of gin on their shelf, because they all have a place, and a style that you should be looking for, right? You don't have just one bottle of whiskey, right? You have multiple.
Totally.
Bottles of gin on there, and they all do different things for you.
100%. I don't know if we can justify getting bigger houses and the extra bedroom to fit all those bottles in. But for me, it's funny because the bottles are so beautiful that there's probably loads of bottles in my living room that are just about to be finished, but I just can't quite bring myself to have that last shot.
Yeah.
Yes. One last question. You've mentioned a lot of words. If you were to sum up Upend in one word or phrase before you go, for each of you, what would that be?
You want to go first, Matt?
Experimentation.
Yeah, 100%. That definitely comes through. Chris?
We could be really simple and use Upend, but I think
I should write that in the rules. Don't use your brand name.
I think bold is definitely one that is meaningful to us. It was what we wanted to have, bold, unique flavor profiles. So I think bold really stands out. And I'm going to give myself a bonus word, and relatable. We want to turn off that idea that, gin can be unapproachable for some people. And that brand sometimes can be unapproachable, right? Even though our style is premium and bold, we want it to be relatable as well. People to be able to identify it and experience it with us.
That's a really good one. Well, Matt and Chris, it has been an absolute pleasure to have spent the last 40 minutes with you, understanding Upend a little bit more, being able to talk a little bit more about your plans and what you're bringing to the table. And I think it's just really exciting what's happening in New York State, communities, distillers. It's really putting a stamp on things, and I appreciate and am grateful for the representation you're bringing through your brand at Upend. Can we promise, please, to maybe reconnect in a year's time, see how things are going?
Yeah, let's do it. Yeah, thank you for this. We appreciate the time you've given us to talk about our brand. We would take all day long if you gave it to us. So
same. But we don't. Really a real pleasure. We will definitely keep in touch, and thank you again. Really grateful.
Great. Thank you.